Okay, today I'm going to show you guys how to cook, in my opinion, one of the hardest steaks on the barbecue grill, which is a T-bone steak or a porterhouse. And that's mainly because you have the sirloin side and then obviously you have the tenderloin side, and you have to be really careful with your temperature control. So in this video, I'm going to give you guys my tips and tricks to at least help you or guide you in cooking a good porterhouse or a T-bone on the barbecue grill. Let's dive in. Okay, so the first advice that I want to give you is do not be discouraged. I know it's hard, and I know sometimes you'll get one side of the steak that's really, really good, and then if you cross over to the other side of the bone, it's overcooked, it's not that great, and you're having some problems. Use a thermometer, and it's up to you if you want to monitor the tenderloin side or the sirloin side. If the tenderloin is most important to you, like it is for most people, by all means, monitor that side. But in general, use the bone to your advantage. Use the bone to deflect most of that heat, or even better, absorb most of that heat and protect the steak, and you should be good to go. But generally speaking, temperature control is the key. Okay, so what are some tips and tricks? So when you're cooking a T-bone or a porterhouse, you really do want to take advantage of the reverse sear method, because you want to try to hit the steak with low temperatures first to keep it juicy, moist, and flavorful and not overcook it. And then when you finally do get that internal temperature that you're looking for, you finish it off with a good sear. I like to start off my temperatures around 350 to around 375, somewhere around there, sometimes even lower, depending on the size of the cut, right? But if I'm doing an 1.5-inch steak, which I typically do, or 2 inches, then I try to keep it at around 350. And I'll monitor the temperatures. I'll make sure the bone is facing the side of the charcoal, the side of the heat, so it's absorbing most of that heat. Using a wireless thermometer, I'll keep an eye on the temperature, and then right when I hit about 115 degrees internal, I'll do a sear on both sides, and that should get me to medium rare. It's also important to make sure that you absolutely let your steak rest after you've cooked it. You want to allow those internal temperatures to settle, and you don't want those juices to escape. So you can see how crucial temperature control is, both when you're cooking the steak and after you're cooking the steak. But generally speaking, T-bone or a porterhouse is the hardest steak to cook, in my opinion, on the barbecue grill, or just in general, because you have two cuts. That bone is separating two really, really great cuts. You have the tenderloin side and the sirloin side, and they both require a certain amount of attention and detail. So if you can master a porterhouse or a T-bone steak, you're good to go. Today, I do have a porterhouse, or what's defined as a porterhouse, and I did do a dry brine in salt overnight to make sure that salt penetrated all the way through. And I think I have an 1.5-inch cut. So we're looking at about an 1.5-inch cut. I do recommend salting and brining your steak when you do have an 1.5-inch or greater, 2 inches, for example. It really does infuse the steak with salt. Let's go to the barbecue and I'll show you how I cook it using the indirect method. Okay, so first things first, as you can see here, the grill is way too hot. So while I'm waiting for the grill to adjust, because I did close my vents and I'm preparing them, I'm gonna go ahead and talk about the steak. So let's talk about this cut a little bit more in detail. For the porterhouse or the T-bone, you're actually gonna get 2 cuts in one. This bone is separating the cuts. On this side here, the smaller cut, that's actually a fillet. And on the larger cut, that's actually a strip. You can actually think of it as a New York strip. It's literally a New York strip. So the side that has this large fat piece right here, the strip of fat, is basically a New York strip. And on this steak, it's actually the opposite. You can see the strip right here. This is the New York strip where I have the thermometer in there. And then that's the fillet side, or the tenderloin side. So a lot of people consider this a really nice cut because you're getting a New York strip and you're getting a little taste of a filet mignon. It's not the best quality filet mignon, right? It's a filet, but it's still really nice. It's really tender, really flavorful. This entire steak is just incredible. You're getting the best of both worlds. You can tell that they're porterhouse because of the cut. On a porterhouse, basically you get a larger steak, you get more of the tenderloin. And we do have a choice cut here. Both of them are choice cuts. So they're going to be really juicy and high quality. We're going to get a lot of fat in there, but definitely not as much fat as a ribeye steak. And lastly, I did kind of mention that I did dry salt brine them overnight. And you can see here that the salt has completely penetrated through. and there's a little bit of a different color to the steak, but that's what salt brining does. It's really good. I highly recommend it for a thicker cut because you want to get that flavor all the way through the steaks. So as a kind of a general note, I am going to be using the Meter Plus, the probe. It's a wireless probe thermometer. You don't need a wireless thermometer or a fancy thermometer like this one, but you should be using some sort of a thermometer to monitor this cook, especially if you're doing the reverse sear method, because being able to monitor the internal temperature and really have temperature control the entire time, and also considering that these are porterhouses, which is probably the hardest steak to cook on the barbecue grill, or really the hardest steak to cook in general, it's a good idea to monitor your temperatures for that exact internal temperature control. So long story short, get a thermometer. Any thermometer will do, something that's trustworthy, and you should be okay. So a quick note on the coals. This is how I actually set up my 2-zone cooking. I usually use charcoal baskets, but for this cook, I didn't want to do that because when it comes time to sear the steaks, I feel like the charcoal baskets kind of bring the coals way too close to the grill grates, and I wanted to maintain some distance so I don't burn the steaks and char them up. So I left my 2-zone method kind of basic. Right here we have the indirect. This is where I'm going to put the steaks, and here's the direct method. So we're going to take advantage of this. I'm going to lay down the steaks in the indirect side, and I'm going to have the bone facing the heat. The bone's going to absorb the majority of the heat, making sure that we get a nice even temperature for both sides of the steak. All right, now let's start placing our steaks, and we're going to go indirect method, and there we go. Okay, so this is what I was talking about earlier. So here's the bone, and I have the bone facing the heat. I want the bone to absorb most of the heat so we can protect the steaks, because we have those 2 cuts and they both need to be cooked a little bit differently. And here's another view here. You can see the bone on both steaks. I have them both facing, the bones facing the coals, the heat, the direct heat. And I want them to absorb most of that temperature so we can protect the cuts, because the strip side is going to cook a lot differently than the fillet side. The fillet side can be overcooked really easily. And you also see that when we go to sear these steaks, we're going to sear each side slightly differently. We're going to have each side on the direct heat or the flames kind of separately. I want to kind of control that a little bit better, but we'll get to that in a second. Okay, now we're going to close the lid, monitor the temperatures internally and also ambient temperatures using the probe, and we should be good to go. Okay, now we're going to go into our Meter app. I only have one probe set up, which is the Meter Plus. Set up our cook. It's obviously going to be beef, and we're going to go with the T-bone. I don't see a porterhouse, so the T-bone will be the next best thing. It's basically the same thing. And we want medium rare, but I'm going to control this a little bit better. I want to go ahead and reduce this a bit. I want to take it off the indirect heat when we're around, let's say 117, and then we'll start searing. So we'll start the cook. All right, and now the Meter Plus is going to be monitoring everything for me. We got an internal target of 117. Ambient's about 325 and climbing. I want to keep that around 350 to 375, so we'll have to work the vents a little bit more. Okay, so I basically have the vents almost entirely closed, and the bottom vent too, but temperature control is really important. We're actually almost there, about 7 degrees off, so about 3 minutes remaining, and things are looking good. So let's take a look at the steaks. Okay, now before we start searing, we got to remove the steaks from the heat and get the coals piping hot. So here's how I go about searing these steaks. I'm going to put the strip side directly on the coals and the fillet side away from the coals so I can control the sear a little bit better, you know, based on where the bone's at. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side with the fillet, but sear it a little bit less, flip it, and that should get us a good crust, good sear without overdoing it on each side. In hindsight, I wish I would have put the probe in here, but there wasn't enough to really, get to that mark on the meter probe that's required. So that's kind of the disadvantage to the meter probe. With the meter probe, you got to hit that notch right there or it's not going to be very accurate. Okay, the coals are hot. Let's get to work. So the general rule of thumb is for however long they were actually cooking on the grill for, you should let them rest for about that long. So if you're cooking on the grill for 10 minutes or so, you should let them rest for around 10 minutes. If you're really impatient, at least do half of that. You don't have to cover them really tightly with foil. Lightly covering them is just fine. You just want to allow them to rest because if you cut into them right now, all the juices are going to come out. You want everything to kind of settle. And the rule of thumb is for however long, they were in the grill cooking, you should do the same amount, resting.
The steak came out incredibly juicy, and I can't tell you just how wonderful it was, and both sides were incredibly delicious.
I also just bought my daughter a jumper and her cousins were over, so there's a play date going on right now and kids just absolutely love jumpers. So if you want to keep your kids occupied, go buy them a jumper. So if you hear some kids in the background and some chatter and laughter, everybody's having fun today.